Right, okay, we will make a start. And for those joining us later, hopefully they will catch up. Inga mana, inga reo, inga rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia hora te maruna, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei hora hi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Tātou ia tātou katoa, aroha tū, aroha mai, huie tāi kie. I have just welcomed and greeted you all in Te Reo Māori, New Zealand's Indigenous language. It is also fitting at this point to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Australia, on whose land our Australian speakers and participants stand. My name is Justine Daw. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Worldwide Fund for Nature New Zealand, one of the many national offices here in the WWF global movement. I am also a board member of Reconnecting Northland, one of the CalANZ members. I sit on a ministerial advisory group for community-led research, and shortly I am to take up the leadership of the Kaipara Moana remediation program, which is a very large-scale new program to restore the health and well-being of the Kaipara harbour, one of the largest natural harbours in the world and the largest natural harbour in the Southern Hemisphere. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you here today to the Connecting for Wildlife movement webinar, the third in the webinar series on the art of connectivity, brought to you by our CalANZ hosts, Conservation Across Large Landscapes, Australia, New Zealand, the grouping of Gondwana Link, Great Eastern Ranges and Reconnecting Northland. Today's CalANZ webinar focuses on wildlife movement, connectivity for wildlife movement. And that's a particularly poignant topic, I think, as global leaders come together in Glasgow for the Climate Change Conference of Parties meeting. And I think we're all aware of the importance of those discussions globally. It is very clear as global leaders recommit to reducing emissions and taking action on climate change, that climate change is already here. It is affecting not only our communities, Indigenous peoples, very vulnerable and marginalised elements of society, our natural and built environments, but also our very valued habitats, ecosystems and treasured species. Of course, right now, we are also all too aware of the interdependency between humans and nature as we grapple with a global pandemic. And this interdependency between society, between humanity and between nature is very much underscored. So today, as we come into our discussions, I would really invite you to think about what is actually at the heart of adaptation to climate change, to the pandemic, to conservation writ large, and that is about resilience. How do we live well with nature as a society, as humanity, in a very disrupted environment? And the key, I think, is resilience. So I would invite you to bring open hearts, open minds, and open thinking to today's discussion. We are going to need new paradigms beyond the current paradigms to resolve the many conservation challenges. And it's groupings like CalANZ and their participants who are really looking quite holistically for solutions that are a really key part of our future solution for the globe. So please do come with a mindset of learning and openness. Some of today's speakers will also bring Indigenous knowledge to bear, and it is very much around our if you like, our ability to bring different worldviews, different expertises, and different knowledge systems to bear, that we will be able to develop these new paradigms, these new solutions. Before I introduce our first speaker today, I'd like to cover off some quick housekeeping matters. Participants will be on mute and have the cameras off for the session, just to help our broadband and to ensure that we are able to hear and see those who are speaking. But there is a Q&A function. Please do use that right through the session. You can vote for questions too, as I understand it. So it will be very, very important for us to use our discussion session very well to know where the energy and interest is. So please do engage with those Q&As and vote as you can. We will be recording this session, the seminar, and we'll make that available to yourselves as participants following the session. We will also ask you to fill in a survey at the end of this webinar to make sure that the next webinar series are even better than today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. So Gary Howling is here today to talk to us very much around his topic of connecting avian species, if you like, through the session today. Gary is the Executive Director and CEO of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, with a very long involvement in connectivity conservation. Gary's work is grounded in a passion for conserving wildlife migration across Eastern Australia, a topic he considers one of the most and greatest untold stories in global ecology. Since joining the GER team as one of the original members in 2007, Gary has been a leader in providing specialist connectivity conservation advice and was instrumental in initiating a series of very, very large-scale spatial analyses that maintain networks of interconnected habitats to support both ecological and human well-being. So I will invite Gary Howling to take us away with the GER Flyways, Continental Connections for Wildlife on the Wind. Over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine, and good morning, everybody. I'd like to also start the session today, my presentation, by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands that we're joining from today. I'm joining you from Darawal country on the Illawarra South Coast region of New South Wales, and I'd also like to acknowledge their elders and the significance of the number of the matters that we're going to be discussing here today. This year's series of webinars on the art of connecting have demonstrated that connectivity conservation is fundamentally concerned with conserving the connections that exist within and between natural and socio-ecological systems. We're particularly interested in ensuring the continued movement of plants and animals so that they can adapt and persist in the face of continuous and sometimes quite cataclysmic changes in the environment. Next slide, please. The types of movement that we see and what we're talking about in connectivity conservation range across the whole suite of scales, from local to regional, continental, and global. Maintaining habitat and connections that support each of these is a particular tenet of connectivity conservation. Various of the other speakers today will be touching on issues of local and regional movement. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about and reflecting on how we conserve and manage long distance movement in the Australian context, particularly the patterns of seasonal migration, dispersal, and nomadic movement that are characteristic of Australia's variable and unpredictable conditions. Next slide, please. There's actually a surprising lack of general awareness in the Australian community about just how significant long distance movement is as a natural phenomenon in our wildlife. In fact, I've actually heard many times the assertion made by scientists and fellow practitioners, conservation practitioners, that we don't have the kinds of wildlife migrations that you see in the Northern Hemisphere. So what is important about connectivity conservation is it's something that we should really be embracing in the Australian context. The reality is actually quite different, as this table shows. Seasonal migration and other long distance movements are a common feature of between 50 and 60% of Australia's native bird species, around 50% of our marine mammals, and about 10% of terrestrial mammal species. It's also a really common feature in our native freshwater fish. And when we start to scratch the surface of the ecology of our butterflies, we find that there's actually roughly similar proportion of Australian butterfly species that undertake long distance movements to what we observe in parts of North America. What is very different, though, is that our migrants are a lot smaller. Their migrations can tend to be a bit less visible than other parts of the world, more subtle in terms of their movement patterns. And obviously, they are far less well studied in many respects than some of the long-standing natural history studies of the Northern Hemisphere. Next slide, please. By way of some colourful examples, we've got examples like the painted lady, a butterfly species native to southeastern Australia that on a seasonal basis generally moves during spring over an 8-week period across a very broad front from Victoria through to northern New South Wales, sometimes in southern Queensland, across a band that's nearly 600 kilometres wide. They move back in the reverse in February and April. We often see notable events and movement patterns and behaviours when there have been good periods of prolonged rainfall that boost numbers in caterpillars. We don't see anything like the examples that we saw before. Back in the 1880s, for example, there are regular stories in the local press in Victoria about having to shut down the railway system because the tracks were too slick because of the sheer number of butterflies on the trails that the trains weren't able to run on them properly. Moving around the screen, we've got the buff-breasted paradise kingfisher, one of our tropical migrants that routinely crosses the Torres Strait in the New Guinea and beyond. Following the shift in the seasons of the wet season between the north and southern hemisphere. Continuing around, the globe ronderer is renowned as the world's longest distance migratory insect that famously takes 3 to 4 generations to move from northern India down through across the Maldives, down eastern Africa to southern Tanzania, and tracking back with the monsoonal rain patterns during the rest of the year. We actually see similar kinds of movement in this species where it's found down eastern Australia as well. And then finally, the white-striped free-tailed bat, previously thought to be generally a summer hibernator. We actually now know that it migrates south to southerly extremes, trying to stay in locations where the nighttime temperature drops below 21 degrees. So it actually gets the thermal benefits of cool nighttime temperatures. 2009, it actually started appearing in Tasmania, potentially one of our first climate migrants. Next slide, please. So when we look at the species distribution data, particularly on a time series basis, species like the rainbow beater are backdrop species today. There is obviously a very quite distinct marked difference in terms of their summer and their winter distribution. So their summer being the red dots, the blue being the winter distribution dots. Next slide, please. As we dig into the data, we also see that those movement patterns are reflected on a seasonal basis as well, tracking through the year, so that species can be seen moving into different landscapes as the seasons are changing and as they're working through different parts of their natural history and their ecology. Next slide, please. The same data have also been used by various people like Griff Owen and Clark almost 20 years ago now, to actually depict the movement patterns and the pathways and demonstrate the similarities and the variations between different species moving across Eastern Australia, often in very distinctive patterns. Next slide, please. There are a number of commonalities in the different types of species movement that we witness across Eastern Australia. They fall into different types of categories, but they range from your classical north-south seasonal latitudinal migration of things like channel-bill cuckoos, the rainbow beater, through altitudinal migrants where little birds, for example, in particular, get a much similar type of effect in terms of reaching much more temperate locations by moving downhill rather than moving long distances north and south. We have species like our ducks that follow around after the rains on a fairly random basis, but also grey-headed flying foxes and other nomadic nectarivores that likewise follow the boom and bust cycles of the Australian landscape. And of course, we even have a number of refuge seekers, species like the bogon moth that migrates to summer refuge in the high country every year. Next slide, please. There is a general belief around the world that migratory species are actually less significantly threatened than habitat specialists, but we're actually seeing in Australia a growing body of evidence based on the decline in numbers that that's not the case. We're actually seeing quite a significant loss of the source and destination habitats, particularly in lower latitudes, such as in New Guinea, where some of our long distance migrants overwinter. We've also seen an increase in the loss of seasonal feed resources and stopover locations, really important for species moving through their long distance movements across Eastern Australia, increased urbanisation, changes in the prevailing wind patterns that we see across Eastern Australia, but there's also a general poor state of understanding as to what actually is the status of a number of our species, although, as I say, the data does indicate they are declining. Next slide, please. So Great Eastern Range Initiative, in large part, seeks to address the various threats to long-distance migratory species by combining efforts at a local scale to secure the source and destination habitats, maintain those stopover points, but also identify critical refuge areas that are used in periods of extreme, but also locations where species persist, for example, after the Black Summer fires last year. Next slide, please. Significantly, that involves bringing together a lot of information, in particular, as well as the data and the spatial analytical tools that we have at our disposal to develop a much better understanding of the movement patterns that we see across Eastern Australia, but also have a better understanding of how those patterns are likely to change. Next slide, please. So Great Eastern Ranges have partnered with research organisations like Griffith University and the ANU to better utilise existing citizen science data and information systems to inform our understanding. Next slide, please. And also to start and mobilise research and monitoring so that we have a better understanding about where individual animals are actually spending different parts of the year so that we can better target our conservation action. Next slide, please. Critically important in that then will obviously be to bridge the gap in understanding of the wider community and get them understanding the importance of local action to support long-distance migratory species. By way of a couple of quick last slides, the ultimate goal of Great Eastern Range is to mobilise a much broader effort by bringing together a suite of interventions in local areas to do things from establishing habitat for species where they've been lost through to rapidly expediting the recovery of available habitat that's been degraded, such as under the bushfires that we saw last year. Next slide, please. Making information available for different landscapes as to what species they're like to have using their landscapes and what species to plant to provide food for them. Next slide, please. And then also bringing those interventions together, such as we're doing, working in partnership with our partners, Planting for Pollinators, a program run by Dr. Peggy Evie, and a major funding partner, WWF Australia, integrating a suite of activities into projects, in this instance, projects that are targeting koalas and other arboreal mammals, but also integrate feed area restoration for long-distance migratory birds and bats in particular. Next slide, please. And of course, the important factor that GER plays, a role that GER plays that's unique to an initiative working at continental scale, is the ability to aggregate actions across multiple landscapes, bringing multiple complementary interventions together under the auspices of an intentional, scientifically driven strategy to achieve an outcome such as the conservation of long-distance migratory species. I will finish off by just giving a little shout out to this particular little fellow, the shining bronze cuckoo. It's the one species, the one migratory species that's common to the three initiatives presenting here today with populations in New Zealand, Eastern Australia, and Southwest Australia. And importantly, from our point of view, it's one of the very few, one of only 2 or 3 species of land bird that actually cross the Tasman Sea from New Zealand into Eastern Australia, as well as tracking up through the north to the Solomon Islands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's fantastic very much fantastic to see everyone and engage with those slides, and thank you for keeping to time. What I think that we heard that was really challenging, I guess, was the scale of migratory species in Australia, and in fact the nature of that migration. It's probably beyond what most of us had actually understood, and I guess perhaps woven through some of the future speakers' presentations too, you've touched on the importance of community awareness, the importance of community action, and how the CalANZ members are working with local communities to make some real change on the ground. So very much congratulate you and your partners there. Thank you for your presentation. So I would like to move on to Millen Milan Ruka. He will be talking about tuna heke, the eel migration, which is another migratory type of species here that's very much of interest for us today. So Milan Ruka established the Environmental River Patrol to document and report pollution to local councils in Northland. That's the part of New Zealand that I'm based in, so obviously very excited to hear more about that. He has a strong understanding of how Resource Management Act in New Zealand and the processes that associate with that are implemented on the ground, and a very great understanding of perspectives of freshwater users. Milan's involved in advocacy and governance for his hapu, and that is a local word meaning Māori tribe in Parati and Mangaka here. He's worked on many studies into tuna, eel populations and impacts, including the latest research on Māori, Indigenous peoples of New Zealand, and tuna in this, our contemporary world. So very much welcome, ngā mihi to you, Milan, and over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Kia ora tātou katoa, ko Milan Ruka ahau, Wairua te awa, Mangakahe te awa, Whatitiri te mana. It's my mountain and my rivers. Thank you very much for having me today. Reconnecting Northland, and thank you for that introduction, Justine. I set up Environment River Patrol in 2010, and I'd already been working some 2 years prior to that under Kaitiaki Ono Waimāori Pan Hapu group, and decided to set up and do something about our rivers and our tuna. Next slide. Our harbour, the Kaipara, has been long recognised to be in crisis, and significant reports have been done about it, but actually nothing had been really done on the ground. But of course, as Justine just alluded to, there is now a great movement to recover our harbour from the condition it was in prior. Next slide. You can see on this map here in the lower part of the map there, the great Kaipara Moana Harbour, apparently one of the biggest in the southern hemisphere, fed by many rivers, and up in my area of my tribe, Hiri Te Roi, Te Parafau, Te Mahurihuri, the Wairua River and Mangakahe rivers are predominant to us, and I decided to go up and have a look at my rivers further north. Next slide, thank you. Eels are dear to my heart and my whānau, my family. In the old days, I was a builder and often had ups and downs in that industry, and we just go eeling in between it all to supplement our incomes. And that's what I was doing here at this particular time. I just got a plaster off my hand, having broken it in a rodeo. And so I desperately needed I couldn't hammer nails in, so I went eeling as I did. It's, what would you call it? Poacher turned gamekeeper, I guess, where I've evolved to. That eel there is probably 80 years old, 80 to 90 years old. She's definitely female and long fin. And now my life has evolved to look after it. Next slide. So the condition of our rivers is so poor downriver in Portiti, Whatitiri district, that I decided to go way upriver, way up to the Whakapara headwaters and paddle on down from there. This canoe here is inflatable, great for doing this type of work. Just roll it up, put it in the boot of your car, and when you get there, you just roll it out and pump it up, and away you go. Next slide, please. So I started on this journey on the Whakapara, going down to the Wairua confluence and on down. And just as I got around the corner, you can see some white buildings just in the far distance here, in this photo. That's the main road north, State Highway 1. But you can't see anything from the road, very little, because the river, you can only see the river from the bridges that go across it at about 4 locations. But this is what I immediately saw as I was paddling down. Intensive cattle, and from the dairy cattle predominantly, and a lot of beef cattle. Next slide, please. And it was just a continual sight and really stench smell of urine and feces from dairy cattle, and the pock marks are so deep sometimes they're like almost, way past the calf of your leg deep, and full of the urine and excrement, and just all sort of oozing into the river. Next slide, please. Continually progressing down, probably about 3 kilometres downriver here. Still the same, all the way down. Then you'd see another farmer on the other side of the river, doing the right thing, not overgrazing and not intensive grazing. But of course, the farmer on the left here, intensive grazer. Next slide, please. And it just got worse as it went down. Here, out of sight of the road, you can see that the cattle have literally benchmarked out the side of the river, because they're always going for as the rise and fall and floods and what have you, going for the greener grass on the riverbank. And that was their trough too, of course, because there's no troughs up in the paddock. Next slide, please. I've got about maybe 6 or 8 k's down on my journey, and I've been walking the banks, taking a lot of photos, and back into my waka, my canoe, and sat on the bank, and then this dairy herd on the other side here came over. They were having a nosy, and I was sitting there peeling an orange and about to have a cup of tea, if I recall. And but I realised by then, my hands were smelling of urine, excrement, all over me, slipping up and down the banks as I was getting up to take my photos. And I felt very unclean, and yet I'm not a fussy guy. In that regard, I sort of realised the enormity of what I was looking at, what I'd just seen over several kilometres, and I felt so unclean that I couldn't peel my orange. And actually had tears in my eyes there, thinking, how on earth could our rivers get so bad? And that's what I was seeing down below at our homestead, much further down the river. Next slide, please. And so I carried on, just the same scenes all the way down. It takes a lot of excrement, a lot of intensive grazing over many years to get to this condition. Next slide, please. This scene here ended up in the newspapers, and they done a full-page report on my work. And what we were finding was dead cattle everywhere I was, and even there was such abandonment, no care from the farmers that even the tags are still on them. Many cattle were being dragged down to the riverbanks those days. This is 2011, of course, and just leaving their tags on. They didn't even worry about taking them off, and yet here's cattle that are worth over $1,000, I guess, at the time. Next slide, please. And so I started to get quite substantial publicity in this, and that's a big article there, and was gaining traction with our Northland Regional Council here, but they had no policy in place and still don't. We're working on it now. Yeah, I had highlighted just how the Wairua River was that feeds the Whakapara, the Wairua River, that feeds down into the northern Wairua River, which feeds down into that great harbour, the Kaipara, Moana. Next slide, please. That's my Uncle Henry there. This is typical scenes that we were seeing. And we just happened to have a TV crew with us on that particular day, and was out of my hands by then. They were filming my work, and they immediately put it on the news that night of this scene here, this unfenced cow here, dairy cow, Friesian, and it resulted in big article in the newspaper, on the news also, on TV, and but the result of it was, the outcome was, the farmer, he was in Australia on holiday, ironically, and but he he heard of the situation straight away. And but the result of it, the outcome was that he fenced his whole farm off within about 6 months later, and he fenced 7 kilometres off of his farm, and to his credit. And that started the whole sort of movement of farmers' awareness and starting in the Northland Regional Council to offer funding to farmers and fence off the river. But it was the early days of that. Next slide, please. That exact location there is shown in this photo. I think that's about a year and a half later. The exact location there, and that's the fence, the new fence that went up behind, and you can see the growth, that natural growth that took over on the riverbank. It gave habitat to our pukeko ducks, every critter that wants to move up and down the, the riverbanks, and the birds and the bees, of course, and creates that corridor again up on the riverbank, whereas it just wasn't there before. This is our motorboat, Kioriwai, in the background. This is a typical pump station up in our northern part of the catchment, in Hikurangi Swamp. We've got 7 pump stations, and they are catch water off the, or retain water off the flatlands of some 50,000 acres. And what we see here is one of the pump station outlets. Of course, my presentation is about looking kaitiaki te tuna, our eels, but I'm emphasising here the work, the habitat, loss of habitat, poor water quality, and the other perils. And one of the major perils is this, one of these, the 7 pump stations, and this is one of them, Narara Tunua. And that's looking upriver on the flats that these pump stations operate. They hold the water back during big floods. Then they pump the water out into the river, which is on this side of the photo. So that's water being retained, building up within flood situations. And then at some point in the flood levels, they pump it into the river. Here's the pumps here, typical, thank you. And those pumps here go thousands of RPM. And on the next slide, please, you'll see the blades on the pump there, and they're what cuts our eels up as they come through. Now, these pumps here have been there since the mid-80s. What's that, near 40 years. And so when the eels migrate out of those flatlands or on the hills, upper parts of the catchments in the small streams, and come down onto those flatlands, into behind the pumps, as we saw in the earlier photos, they still have to get past this pump station, these blades here, because it all funnels down into there. So that's a new pump there that's replaced that previous pump. But however, its operational mode, it actually pumps, I believe it can fill an Olympic-sized pool that we have here in Whangarei, it was compared to, at least, just in a matter of minutes, 10 minutes, I think, and that's its capacity. So here, this is what was happening, it still is, despite having a consented process and laws ensuring safe fish passage. Our native tuna, our eels here, this one might be about 40 years old. You can see where the head's been cut off on it, coming through the pumps. That's Alan Halliday there with me, since passed away. A great identity up here in the north of looking after our eels. We were on doing a patrol on this particular day. Next slide, please. And that's the scenes that we see. Continual eels cut up. Next slide, please. Just it's an annual event every March when our eels run. Next slide, please. And once we motored boat down the river, we continually find mortality of eels same as this. And we gather them up for evidence-based reporting. Next slide, please. It's a typical scene. And at our power station here, further downriver, the eels actually in that same floodwaters. You can see those artificial falls to the left on this canal. The eels go over to their peril and get crushed on the stone down below that you could see in those early photos. Or they get through into the power station through these unmaintained drills and go on down to the turbines to be cut up again further down. Sorry, please. And there's the falls, artificial falls, where the eels come over and hit onto these rocks. Or because nobody's taken the time to really, track their life cycle and all the events and the perils of their journey. Next slide, please.
1 minute warning, Millen. Thank you.
It's the outlet of the power station. Next slide, please. But we have resolved here. There's an alva ladder. Get our alvas back upriver on the side there. Very successful, implemented in 2011. Next slide, please. We're monitoring here with NIWA. That's probably another 80, 90-year-old eel there. Identifying longfin. Still the scenes go on, typical like this, but we are going through the RMA now to have regulations in place, but we're still going to need monitoring and enforcement, of course. Next slide, please. My Uncle Henry, I dedicate this presentation to him, since passed away at 90 years old. Loved going on the river and was born on the side of the wider river. Next slide, please. And he done many patrols with me, and it's very vigorous old fellow to try and maintain and get our river back into how he remembered it as a child. Kia ora tātou katoa. Kia ora, Uncle Henry. Thank you very much, everybody, for allowing me to present today. And kia ora, Australia, and Aotearoa. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora tātou, Millen. Thank you so much for your presentation today. Gosh, aren't pictures, don't they paint 1,000 words? Very concerning, but also inspiring. And I think what your presentation has, highlighted to everyone is the importance of local action, the power of local action, and the power of local voices. So I know that many participants, including those who are starting to post in our Q&A, are pointing to what can they do to take action. So kia ora very much, and thank you, Ngā mihi ata ākoe. Fantastic. Also, just want to acknowledge the action, the local guardianship that you and others in your group have provided. So thank you. I'd now like to introduce Keith Bradbury, who's going to be talking about emus, fences and storylines, which is a fantastic title for the presentation, and it means that we'll be interested looking to see what comes out of that. But Keith is currently CEO of Gondwana Link, one of the Callan's founders. He's instrumental in establishing in 2002 and is also Deputy Chair of the National Landcare Network in Australia. Long-time advocate for the ecological values of the southwestern Australia and the strength of very much of grassroots action. As a community-based activist in the early 1980s, Keith helped halt the clearing of some 3 million hectares of public land for marginal agriculture. And as a concerned local, he was also involved in establishing some of Australia's earliest landcare groups and Australia's first activated biosphere reserve program. Keith has consulted to emerging large landscape efforts in New Zealand through Reconnecting Northland and also Southern Africa and Mexico. So we very much welcome you here today. Thank you very much, Keith.
Thank you, Justine. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm talking to you from Goring Noongar land in southwestern Australia. And we work with Wadandi, Bibbulmun, Goring, Menang, Dalarak, Naju, and to some extent Mirning peoples. It's a very rich traditional culture over here, and it's coming back to its strength. I'm not sure if I fully understand all the art that our Noongar colleagues produce, but I was explaining that to the artist of this painting one day, and he suggested I look at the title, which I think is a pretty good summary of where we still are in Australia. Next slide, please. So the title I've got, Emus, Barriers, Storylines. As with my Callan's partners, we work in connectivity. We work in strengthening one of the vital features of ecological resilience that we need in a time of climate change. And of course, a lot of the structures in the world around us don't encourage connectivity. Next slide, please. So just some quick background on our program. We're nearly in our 20th year at Gondwana. After a few decades of land care and other environmental work, we realised the urgency was there to scale up and be far more ambitious. And we picked the country we're part of is the southernmost bits of southwestern Australia, where most of the big bits of bush remaining are, where there is a strong chance of achieving connectivity over 1,000 kilometres, where most of the hotspots in the biodiversity hotspot are, and where as climate heats up and animals move south, we're the south. So we're trying to make that ready for them. Next slide. I really, given the slightly difficult topic I've got, I really wanted to stress that you do most of this work through friendship, generosity, goodwill, cooperation, cohesion. The future-looking need for transformative environmental change. But as Milan has had, sometimes you get difficult issues that you've got to tackle reasonably head on. Next slide. In this talk, when I talk about we, I'm actually talking about a whole suite of groups that work together in a somewhat cohesive manner. I try and do as little as possible. It doesn't always work that way, but one of our goals is to strengthen the groups we work with. Next slide. And connectivity is about grasping opportunities. It's not about saying we've got to, in essence, ideally, it's not about saying we've got to deal with this threat, we've got to say no to that. But sometimes you do. And we should recognise that the only reason we have the opportunity to create large-scale connectivity is because the decades of opposition to development means we do have some large national parks and other features. Next slide. And across our 1,000 kilometres, there's a whole range of issues that have been tackled over the past that we build on. Some are still being tackled today. WA has just become an Australia first in phasing out logging in all our native forests. We have groups working on the prescribed fire issue and fire in a drying climate. We give them lots of support. Sometimes, as we do with our colleagues in the mining industry, you're not going to stop mining in WA, but we work with the industry to say, well, you could do it better, you could spread the benefits wider. You've got to be more careful. And now, next slide, we'll go to an issue where we've had to lead. Really keen on feces over here. We study them intensively. They can tell you a lot. They also tell you a little bit about connectivity in our landscapes. Very briefly, we're an incredibly old ecosystem, 250 million years of continuous evolution. And the plants tend not to move around the landscape much, not even as seeds. They tend to drop their seeds where they are. Pollen moves a bit with the honey eaters, but the main seed movement is either intense wildfires and the willy willies, we don't encourage them, or a few vectors such as our environmental management units we have, which some people call emus. And they're emu droppings, and I'd note they carry small and large seeds. The large seeds here are our quandong, a key bush tucker, and our sandalwood, a species that just hasn't regenerated in the wild in southwestern Australia for a very long time. Next slide. Very quickly, a history of fencing, fortress farming, this business of trying to lock out all the natural ways of the world. Started here with a noble effort to try and keep European rabbits out of Western Australia in the early 1900s, 1902 to 1907. a fence from the south coast up to the Pilbara was built in just 5 years. Camels, horses, huge effort. Unfortunately, by the time the fence was up, the rabbits were the other side of it, so they built another one. And that fence, number 2 rabbit-proof fence, enclosed the southwest agricultural corner, the one area where it's wet enough to grow crops and run livestock, and has been maintained for most of its length to keep dingoes out of the farming areas. But when agriculture was expanded in the 1960s, there was a break made in the bottom bit. And it wasn't continuous, which meant the wetter southwest forest areas had a connection through to the inland, and that is an old pathway for emus. Next slide, please. That's what's been happening for 100 years. The significant emu migrations have been held up by the fence, and the emus die a pretty miserable death of starvation and thirst unless they get tangled in the fence. Sometimes the corpses are that high that they literally overflow the fence. I don't think that's what we should be doing in 2021. Thank you. But in 2010, it was announced that the fence would be fully extended to totally lock off the southwest corner. And we had to come out on that. Now, the dotted red line in the map to the left is actually where we believe, we were never shown maps, it was intended to build the fence. And what do you know, 3 or 4 years later, we discovered that the local government authorities were trying to get another 500,000 hectares of the Great Western Woodlands opened up for farming. There's an interplay here you've really got to look out for. We brought together a consortium of groups and scientists, laid out concerns, published simple requests for information, and that led to significant change. The fence was going to be built in 2010. It hasn't been. We did push forward a formal EPA assessment of the fence proposal as it was in 2016. And by that stage, it had been dropped down to the farmland boundaries. Next slide, please. So the concerns were raised. Number one, you can't just do something this profound without open public consultation and bringing the science in and environmental assessment. It was a colonial era fortress farming tool that is just way out of time. And no one was thinking through what other options might be. And then there was a range of specific environmental concerns, and we published them with a number of colleagues. And I'm not going to speak too much for the Dalarak people, but you know, there are significant cultural concerns when you break up a landscape and stop its connectivity. Most assessment, both of the ecological and the cultural, looked at what would be damaged on the actual site of the fence, whereas in fact the landscape is a much bigger thing. Next slide, please. And the EPA and heritage assessments, as I've said, really just focused on the actual thin strip of land for 700 kilometres, not what it meant over the bigger thing. The EPA system is not able to cope with landscape function. It is all about rare species and pollutions and so on. We did have a win. They stopped calling wildlife vermin. They still haven't built it because the department was so keen on pushing ahead with this regardless that it did not follow even the minimal heritage assessment criteria in WA. Next slide, please. Now, in our first webinar, we had Tony Adamson from the Dalarak people in Esperance, who have significant concerns about this fence and have been expressing them. I'm not going to tell their story. It's not right for me to do that. But I do want to say that it's the First Nations people of that area who are looking to the future, who are saying quite openly that this is a damaged landscape. Our emphasis now has to be on repairing it, not further damaging it. Next slide. So, WA, the governmental arrangements give us some protection to rare species in situ, but not much protection for those factors that make species rare or for cultural heritage. We've achieved a lot in improving, in reducing the damage this proposal will cause merely by putting sunlight and fresh air onto it and making sure a wider range of people know about it. Tenacity is important, just as Milan has been telling us. We were told that just go away, we're going to build the thing, you haven't got a hope. And that was in 2010. And it's interesting that once you take a bit of leadership and do it in a respectful and cooperative and open way, you generally find there's more people in a rural community in support of your views than might otherwise come up. So there you go, stick to the facts, shine a light, recognise there are real needs the industry is trying to meet, promote positive options. Have I got one more slide? There we go. I just wanted to finish with this. It's not the laughy cartoon I like to finish with. It's the jawbone of a chuditch, a quoll they call them in Eastern Australia. We still have quite a few here, and that's one of the jawbones you will find in a dingo trap. We are still fighting our wildlife and really do have to start learning to live with it better. Thank you.
So thank you very, very much, Keith. That was a fantastic outline of the many years and decades of work and activity by yourself and many others. And I think what's encouraging and inspiring about your presentation is that it outlines a little bit of thinking around a blueprint for success, which, you know, we all could use some pathfinders in that respect. I think your session also highlighted the importance of collaborative leadership, which I know that the Callens members work very, very significantly to achieve, and the value of recognising Indigenous aspirations, Indigenous worldviews and values. So thank you for that, and I'm hoping that we will get some more question and answers in the Q&A function on the webinar, so that for our discussion we can talk further about these and some of the other issues. So I'm here. Okay. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Kylie Soanes, who's going to be talking to us around gliders, roads and wildlife crossings, another intriguingly titled presentation today. So Dr. Kylie Soanes is a conservation biologist at the University of Melbourne within the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. Her research focuses on finding ways to reduce the impacts of roads and urban environments on native species, and that's very key from a connectivity conservation perspective, including looking at trial and evaluation of novel techniques. So this is, you know, in my introduction, I invited us to think about new paradigms, to bring different worldviews and perspectives together, and it looks very much like Kylie is going to be talking to us around her thinking on that. Kylie's PhD research combined genetic data and traditional field methods to evaluate the success of what's called canopy bridges and glider poles for arboreal mammals. So we're very much interested in your thoughts, Kylie. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope the audio is okay. I've just had to switch sources because there is a screaming child in the background that would be very disruptive. But what I'm going to talk to you today is how roads can disrupt some of the broad-scale efforts that we're trying to implement to restore connectivity across landscapes, and some of the ways that we've tried to fix those pesky impacts. Next slide. Sorry, there's a few clicks on this one. So this is the squirrel glider, which is gorgeous and fluffy marsupial, but threatened in the southern parts of its range in Australia. Moves by gliding from trees to trees with an average glide distance of around 30 to 40 metres. But unfortunately, we also have roads like this one, the Hume Highway, and the average width is around 20 to 100 metres. So using some very complicated maths, we can understand that 30 to 40 is, oh, sorry, if you could go back, thank you. 30 to 40 is quite a lot less than 100, which means that roads have a really big potential to impact squirrel glider movement, gene flow and population viability. Next slide, thank you. To set that in a broader context, this map here is, it shows the roadless areas within the southern parts of the squirrel glider range. Now, the roadless areas are these tiny little green flecks that you can see. Everything else is within 1 kilometre of the nearest road. If you could just click forward. Whereas this is a typical landscape within the squirrel gliders range. And you can see the dark green lines here are prime squirrel glider habitat, and they're all associated with roadsides and linear corridors. So what these two images tell us is that off-road conservation is not really possible for squirrel gliders in these landscapes. You know, we can't have these magical, wonderful places uninterrupted by roads to preserve them. If we want to keep them in these landscapes, we need to be able to do it in roadsides. And that means finding ways that enable them to move through the landscape, to access all the resources and mates and gene flow that they need to have viable populations in these roadsides. Next slide. So there are a few different ways that we can try and help animals move across roads, or squirrel gliders in particular. The first one is canopy bridges, which you can see in the very far image here. And it's basically a rope ladder that's strung between trees on either side of the road that the animals can scurry across, and it maintains connectivity at the canopy level. The one in the middle is glider poles, and these are pretty fancy, or they seem pretty fancy. They're actually just big wooden telegraph poles, but they act as stepping stones or fake trees that can allow gliders to get across the road in a few short glides, rather than trying to glide the whole distance that is well beyond their gliding range. And the third option here is vegetated or treed medians, and this involves retaining those big tall trees in the roadsides and protecting them, as well as having wider medians that allow us to have tall trees in the median strips as well. And again, the idea here is that it means we can maintain either canopy connectivity or stepping stones, allowing animals to cross in a few short glides, and just maintaining that natural canopy connection. Next slide, you might have to click through a few things. So all three of these methods have been trialled along the Hume Highway, which is a major road between Melbourne and Sydney in southeastern Australia. The first structures were installed in Victoria as part of a trial, and more were later installed in southern New South Wales as part of the upgrade of the Hume Highway. More recently, there have been some installed at other key sites as we've learned a little bit more about their success. You can see from this image that it's a pretty stunning landscape, and you can just see the glider poles dotted along the side of the highway there. But I just want to, at this point, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this work was carried out, which is the Tamarong, Wavaroo, Yamatang and Wiradjuri. And I pay my respect to the elders past and present. Next slide, please. So all of these methods were fairly new and hadn't really been well tested when we first started out in 2005. So we were really keen to figure out how well they worked. To do that, we set up a collaboration between several road agencies, universities and state government conservation organisations to evaluate the effectiveness of 5 canopy bridges, 15 glider poles and 4 treed medians. And we used a whole range of different methods, including cameras and microchip scanners on the structures themselves, radio tracking to understand the impacts on animal movement, and trapping and genetic analysis to look at gene flow and genetic connectivity. And in a lot of cases, we were able to do this in an experimental design. So we could compare what happened to the squirrel glider populations before and after these structures were installed, or we could compare the sites where we installed structures to sites that remained a barrier or where no action was taken at all. And that way we could get a really good understanding of what kind of impact have we really had compared to if we had just left it as it was. Next slide, please. So the first thing to jump to is that yes, animals did use these novel and unusual structures. We've detected 5 species of arboreal mammals. Apologies to the New Zealand people who have to look at this common brush-tailed possum and hear me rave about how amazing it is. But we also detected squirrel gliders, importantly, on both the glider poles and the rope bridges, common ringtail possums, sugar gliders, and the brush-tailed phascogale, which is quite an endangered species in the area. So we were quite excited to see that one there. Now, obviously, only gliding species were detected on the gliding pole, but our cameras also featured a range of really interesting wildlife, from cockatoos, goannas, microbats. I think there were some tree frogs up there at one point, and just loads and loads of huntsman spiders. If you could just click one forward, thank you. And we've shown thousands of, oh, sorry, back, thank you. There's been thousands and thousands of crossings in the 10 or so years of monitoring of all of these sites. And the camera footage showed us that there were multiple individuals. You can see here, they're carrying their young across. They felt, well, they seemed to be quite comfortable using the structures. And all of this was really good news for how well they would be accepted. Next slide. We also learnt that, firstly, I can't spell re-establish, but that putting these crossing structures in can re-establish movement against over long time barriers. So using our radio tracking, we compared the amount of times that squirrel gliders crossed the freeway at these different types of sites. So there was the road with no mitigation, there were roads with the trees in the middle, and then there were sites that had no roads. And you can see here that at the freeway, sorry, if you could just jump back, at the freeway where there's no structure in the middle, we have really, really low crossing rates compared to when we have those big tall trees. So that's a great big tick straight away for keeping those trees in the median. Not quite as good as if we didn't have a freeway at all. Then what we did is we went to some of these sites that had no structures at all. They had a great big barrier of more than 50 meters, and we installed crossing structures at some of them, either canopy bridges or glider poles. Then we went back again and radio tracked the animals to see what effect that it had on movement. So you could just click forward. Thank you. And these blue dots show what happened after the mitigation was installed. So straight away, you can see where there's a road plus crossing structures, we have a much bigger improvement compared to if the road was left unmitigated and we did nothing at all, which is really great. Almost on par with the vegetated treed medians, but interestingly, not as good again as if we had left the road, but if we hadn't had a highway in the first place. So while we can re-establish movement across existing roads, we should always be aiming to avoid that cut through the habitat in the first place if we can. Next slide, please.
1 minute warning.
Thank you. Lastly, our genetic analysis looked at the individuals going across the roads and what influence they were having on gene flow. If you could just click through a couple. Thank you. So these are 3 different individuals that lived on opposite sides of the highway at this site. And through our genetic analysis, we were able to say not only did they use the crossing structure to get across the road, but that the mother and father lived on opposite sides of the road, had a bit of a sexy rendezvous using the glider rope bridge crossing structure. And that resulted in this offspring here. So the individuals that are using these bridges are the ones contributing to gene flow and restoring genetic connectivity across roads. Move ahead, thank you. So what we've learned from this is that we can facilitate glider movement across roads, enabling habitat access and broader landscape connectivity. And final slide. And the main lessons that we learned from this are that evaluation is really important for us to figure out if we're meeting our conservation goals and these structures are functioning the way that they should. Placement is really important. So considering putting your mitigation measures in existing movement pathways and considering the broader landscape context. And type of mitigation is a question that we get a lot, which of these options is better than the other? Unfortunately, we can't answer that yet. It seems that the placement of the structure is much more important than the type, whether it's a bridge or a glider pole or a vegetated median. But there's always going to be a trade-off between the cost, the feasibility, and the benefits to other species that need to be considered. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your interesting presentation, Kylie. And I love those photos of those brush-tailed possums. So we appreciate that here in New Zealand. And I guess for myself, what my take home from your presentation has been is really around often people want to do the right thing and they want to know which mitigation option or which activity makes best impact, best benefit. And that's the criticality of science and innovation and trying to understand that, shining a light around how to use our time, how to use our resources, and how to use our knowledge best to get the outcomes we're all seeking of nature. And humanity, society living well with each other. So thank you for shining that light on us, Kylie. So I am very much looking forward to our next speaker. Thanks very much, Kylie. I'm liking now to introduce Eamon Nathan, who is our Pou Manatu, our leader of the Reconnecting Northland organisation here in New Zealand. Eamon will be talking about the pipi whāroroa, the manu tohotau, the shining bronze cuckoo, and that's very much a seasonal indicator bird. So very much look forward to hearing more about a very local but very important bird species here in the north. Thanks very much, Eamon.
Tēnā koe, Justine, thank you for that introduction. E mihi ana ki a koutou te marea e whakarongo mai ana. Greetings to you all, those listening in to this presentation today. I'm coming to you live from Whangarei, Te Renga Paraua, the Māori place for Whangarei. And so I'm here to people of this land, the many hapu, upon whose land we sit at present. So I want to also acknowledge the previous speakers. I'm going to be taking a slightly different approach to this presentation. I'll be talking about a migratory species, as Justine mentioned, to whom a significant amount of Indigenous knowledge is associated. This special little bird is known on these shores in Aotearoa, Te Waipounamu, New Zealand, as the pipi whāroroa, or sometimes the whāroroa for short, which is the Māori name for the shining bronze cuckoo. It's referred to in a number of other ways, pursuant to the pūrākau and the stories associated to its nature, its behaviour, and the things that it symbolises. One of these terms is he manu tohutau, the bird that signals the season. This speaks to the fact that when the pipi whāroroa migrates to Aotearoa and its call is heard, it signifies the emergence of spring. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start with a personal story, a story about this dignified leader. Her name is Pipi Whāroroa o Raumati Cummins. She is my great-great-grandmother on my father's line, and she was the youngest of 5 siblings. Granny Pipi, as we know her, was born into a time of significant change amongst her people and indeed nationally, with one of the, I suppose, with the onset of colonisation and land loss amongst other things. Seeking an outcome that would see her people emerge from the adversity as a thriving nation, as a thriving people, and a nation that would blossom like the flowers of spring and realise the abundance that spring and summer brings. The people named her Pipi Whāroroa o Raumati, the Pipi Whāroroa, or the shining cuckoo of summer, placing upon her the aspirations of her people, much like the Pipi Whāroroa brings at the time that it migrates. Next slide, please. So here's an image of the little creature, quite a striking bird. However, as beautiful as it is, it's not often seen. Rather, its presence is known by its distinctive call. As mentioned, it migrates to Aotearoa from the north in the area of the Solomon Islands, arriving in early spring. Next slide, please. One of the places where it first touches down is here. Now, this place is called Maumanu. It is the ancestral mountain of the Te Roroa people, one of the western tribes of Western Northland, the same tribe of my great-great-grandmother, Pipi Whāroroa o Raumati, and through her lines, this is also one of my ancestral mountains. Journeying such a great distance is thirsty work, I imagine. I haven't done it myself, like these birds do every year. So to avoid dehydration, this clever little bird carries with it, on its journey, a little stone. Some writing suggests that that these birds carry the stone, that the Pipi Whāroroa carries these stones in its claws, licking it when their mouth begins to get dry to produce saliva. My elders, however, tell me that it carries the stone in its mouth for the same reason, much like we might chew gum, I suppose. This is the version, I suppose, that I see to have more logic. So, exhausted from their journey, they land at Manganui and they deposit their stones there. The name of the summit of Manganui, which you can see at the top of the moment there, is known as or called Tapuatea. This name was given to the site by the ancestors that voyaged to Aotearoa, New Zealand, on the ancestral canoe called Mahuru ki te Rangi. Tapuatea was a place in Polynesia from whence they left. This practice creates both, or naming a place from the original homeland, creates a physical and spiritual connection to the spiritual homeland of our people. Next slide, please. So, considering that, and coming back to this little bird and some of the stories associated to it, the pipi wharaoroa is known as the manu Hawaii, or te manu Hawaii, the bird of Hawaii. So Hawaii is a general name describing the spiritual homeland of the Maori people. It is believed that the pipi wharaoroa was observed by our ancestors many, many hundreds of years ago, departing the shores of the Pacific Islands and then returning months later. These observations confirmed to them that there must be some land south. And it is said that this inspired the migrations from Hawaii to Tapuatea and to Aotearoa, or from Tapuatea, I should say, to Aotearoa. This corridor is also sometimes associated to the Kuekuea, which is the Māori name for the long-tailed cuckoo, who also migrates from the northern Pacific Islands. Next slide, please. So in Māoridom, a lot of knowledge is captured in words, not solely, but a lot of it, in song, in stories, in proverbs, and etc. There are many sayings associated to the pipi wharaoroa, and here are but a few. So the first one, ka tangi te pipi wharaoroa ko te karere o Mahuru. Mahuru is the fourth month of the Māori lunar year, roughly September by the Gregorian calendar. So what this is particularly saying is that this saying associates the call of the pipi wharaoroa, the tangi, ka tangi te pipi wharaoroa, the call of the pipi wharaoroa to the arrival and the emergence of Mahuru. And more importantly, all the new life that comes with this new season, hence he manu tohu tau, hence the bird that symbolises the new season. Another term is aroaro a manu. This is a reference to the evident increase of bird life at this time of year, particularly the migratory birds such as the pipi wharaoroa. This one I love, he manu kumara. He manu kumara is a reference to the fact that these birds arrive at the time that the gardens are being prepared for kumara to be sown, and then they leave when they are harvested around Potu Te Rangi, or around about March. So the arrival of the bird, the pipi wharaoroa, is directly related to the sowing of the kumara, and then they decide that they're going to leave when the kumara are to be harvested. So he manu kumara. They're a cheeky bird. They shirk their parental duties by laying their eggs in the nest of the riroriru, which is the grey warbler, and so do the koikoea. Koikoea being the long-tailed cuckoo, they lay their eggs in the whitehead's nests. So, pursuant to that action or that behaviour, the phrase kia rite koe ki te pipi wharaoroa, or kia rite koe ki te koikoea, is a phrase used for someone who is lazy or irresponsible. And finally, for this slide, the moment you've all been waiting for, the songbird, or the bird song of the pipi wharaoroa. Can I ask you, Eric, to click on that soundbite there? Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully you all heard that. So there are two parts to that, or two main parts to that call. The first part being the cooey, 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 cooey sound, which is heard earlier in the season and before the fruits of the land and the forest are ready. The second part of the call, where it kind of dips down, whitiora, 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 speaks to and is a sign or a symbol that it's only heard, or that part of the call is only heard when the fruits are abundant and that the food supplies for the season are assured. So this bird is so in tune with the fruits around it and the foods around it that it's able to adapt its call to indicate when the food is ready. Now, obviously, our people were able to observe and listen to this over the many, many years, and were able to associate that, the distinction between the two different types of calls. Next slide, please. So, in closing, there's a real, what I wanted to just sort of point out through this conversation, through this presentation, is that there's a real wealth of richness of knowledge of our natural world contained in Indigenous knowledge through years and years of observation. The pipi wharaoro and the stories associated to it are but one of these examples. And in these stories, we can find inspiration, we can find information and knowledge founded upon hundreds of years of observation, and we can also find aspirations, all of which we can use if we're in tune with and understand it to guide our actions into the future. We need, and in the present more particularly, I suppose we need to be more present than futuristic. We need all of this kind of and more knowledge to adapt and grow our resilience by combining worldviews, as Justine mentioned, to realise new paradigms, helping humanity to thrive on Earth. There's one last thing I want to share. So I mentioned earlier that spring, no, that's the end of the slide, so this is the last slide, thanks, Eric. I mentioned that spring was the time for preparing the gardens, which comes with, and it requires a lot of hard work. Preparing the gardens and so forth. So if someone is critical of one's work or work they are doing, or the work that they're doing, the saying is, I hea koe I te tangi o te pipi wharauro. So where were you when the song of the pipi wharauro was heard? So to suggest, okay, so we're digging these gardens, and where were you when all of this hard work was being done? I hea koe te tangi o te pipi wharauro. So perhaps a challenge to us all, in the broader scope of things, and as we move into and through these unprecedented times, is to ask ourselves, I hea koe I te tangi o te pipi wharauro. Well, what am I doing at this time when we need all hands on deck? Bueno, ka waiho pēr ki reira. I'm going to close it there, but I wanted to actually just say one last thing. Actually, no, I wanted to sing a song. And this song is composed by a wonderful Māori composer, the late Henry Melbourne. He wrote composed a number of songs. And this song is about the pipi wharauro. Many people will know it. So here we go. Pipi wharauroa, nau I tō mai te mahana, kia pua wai ngā rākau, kia rere te kākara. Tioro tioro te koanga, kui kui te raumati, kui kui whiti whiti ora, whiti whiti ora. Kia ora everybody. Thank you very much for listening in.
Thank you very much, Eamon. It was very inspiring and wonderful to end our discussions today, or at least our speaker discussions, with a song. So thank you. And I think your session really highlighted the importance of the shift from assuming the sovereignty of humans, about our nature, if you like, to acknowledging the mana, the spiritual power of nature to build more cohesive and resilient communities. So thank you for that, korero, for that discussion, and for that beautiful sounds, yours and the birds. We really appreciate that. Kia ora e ngā mihi koe. So I'd now like to, first of all, just provide a very short but very sincere thank you to all of our speakers. Gary, Malin, Keith, Kylie, Eamon, you have all challenged us, inspired us, concerned us, but also have really shone a light on the issues of the discussion today. Because we're running a little behind time, I hope you will not mind too short a thanks, but I would like to move us into the discussion piece today. The Q&A panel we've got some questions there, and we've also got some other ones coming in directly. So I'd like to start first with the chat, the Q&A panel discussions. We've got 8 or 9 in there, and I'm going to work with in, if you like, top to bottom order. That means that for our speakers, I'll be calling your name first and then asking the question. So for Gary, Rhonda has asked a really important question, which is quite a solutions-focused question here, which I really like, and that's how close do habitat fragments or adult or larval food plants need to be for most butterflies to detect that they are, thus able to reach them? How do we make sure there's that migratory connectivity as stepping stones or as ultimate goals? What's your thoughts on habitat fragments? Thank you.
It tends to be very much as per any rule of thumb with connectivity conservation, minimising the gap distances as much as possible. We tend to aim for around about 100 metres. But when it comes to butterflies in particular, when you think about the way that they actually move through the landscape, but also their life cycle generally, they tend to, the rule set tends to be very much focused on the individual species and variable species to species. So in some instances, or in most instances, when they're moving through the landscape, they're dispersing. They're at the mercy of the winds. They will often disperse during periods of particularly high winds so that they can get further afield. But also, it's worthwhile thinking about the ecology of the species concerned, and whether or not simple patch difference is the only distance is the only thing that you need to be thinking about. A number of the copper butterflies in Eastern Australia, like the Bathurst copper in the central tablelands of New South Wales, or the Eltham copper down in central Victoria, actually rely very strongly on the presence of a particular species of Bursarea, but also the presence of a particular species of ant with which their larvae in particular have a strong symbiotic relationship with. So it's not just an issue of gap distance. Quite often, if you make the conditions available, butterflies will often find whatever it is that they're needing.
Thanks very much for that. I'd like to move on to a slightly unrelated question for Keith, but one that's come next, and I think it's important to cover off too. First of all, thank you from Anissa for you, Keith, for your presentation. She had no idea that was happening in Western Australia. So the question there is, have alternate options for rabbit control, etc., been looked at by the government? Is the mindset changing at all? Is there any hope? And what will it take to stop this sort of thinking or change the current thinking? Thank you.
Thanks, Justine, and thanks, Anissa. I probably wasn't quite clear enough. The 2 rabbit-proof fences were built as rabbits were moving west across the continent, and they both failed. So we live with rabbits, and I think the same control methods that are used across Australia are used here. The fences have been, or they're allowed, decline a bit, but started being upgraded in the 1920s, 1930s, and have been predominantly used as part of the control mechanism for dingoes, emus, and kangaroos. And the emus in particular are the ones that do the big mass migrations. But if I can just pick up on that second bit of your question, I mean, our deep concern is that a technique that was appropriate in 1907 is being used for wildlife in 2021 and is no longer appropriate. And there are other options, and there are farmers who quite successfully manage dingoes in amongst their flocks. And the emus, well, we do just have to let them into some parts of southwestern Australia. Otherwise, they die these terribly painful, miserable deaths en masse, and we lose a key bit of connectivity.
Thank you. That's a very stark comment and an important one. David Rush has made a comment to Kylie now. He's thanked Kylie and and he would like to talk with you further about your research. He comes from the Illawarra Shoalhaven GR region and is very keen to think about the importance of retaining roadside trees in their area. So South Coast New South Wales and also Greater Gliders. So I'll leave it to you to connect. But there is a next question from Gary for yourself, which is around when retrofitting wildlife crossings, what sorts of data are useful to amass before making initial contact with roading people to have that conversation?
That's a really important question. I think, firstly, I made my little joke at the start about how it's very complicated maths, that if a glider can only glide 30 to 40 metres and a road is wider than that, then you have a problem. But we actually do quite detailed drawings of the height of the roadside trees, the width of the road, and then taking into account what we call the glide ratio for a species. So for squirrel gliders, we have a rough idea of when they launch from the top of a tree, how far they can reach, how low they'll fall before, and basically how close they need a tree to be in order for them to firstly make a glide across a certain distance, but also to make it at a safe height. So you can imagine a lot of the roads they could potentially physically get across, but by the time they're about to finish their glide, they're right in front of a truck or a car, which increases the mortality risk. So firstly, just getting an understanding of what kind of gap you're dealing with and whether that's beyond the known reach of the target species. Also understanding, are there gliders present? Is the place that you're looking at, maybe it's not chock full of gliders right now, but it could be a potentially important movement corridor for dispersal and those more rare movement events rather than everyday access. And just, try and get a handle on how interested and willing either the road agency or the local council is to protect biodiversity and pull those strings that way using their policies. I think they're really important things but basically we're talking about, what's the logic for placing them where they are. So if you can demonstrate that there's potential benefits to gliders and a big gap, then I think that's a really good place to start. And of course, pointing them to all the research that shows that these crossing structures can work is really important as well.
Thanks, Kylie. And look, Robin has also asked a very similar question, which you may have addressed, and that was around when mapping squirrel gliders, how did you come up with the 1 kilometre as a key distance when considering connectivity? So it may be a different answer there, but so
that map where I mentioned the 1 kilometre, that with all the white space, that's actually got nothing to do with squirrel gliders themselves. That's just the extent of the roads within the squirrel gliders range. So wherever you go within most of the squirrel gliders range, you can't go more than 1 kilometre without hitting some kind of road. And so what I was just illustrating there is that roads are everywhere through this species range. So we need to find some ways to combat them and to help, it's very argumentative language, to help squirrel gliders get across and bridge those gaps.
Thanks, Kylie. That's really clear and appreciate that that's answered the questions there. Appreciate that. So next one is for Amon. So very much from Anne. Thank you for your interesting talk. In Europe, there have been observations of cuckoos' arrival time changing. So when they're migrating, they're coming at a different time than in the past. Do you know if changes in the arrival of the pipi wharoa have been observed here in New Zealand?
I am aware that there was a study done. Actually, I'm just checking. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Change my audio device. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm aware that there has been some recent citizen science carried out here around about 4 or 5 years ago that had observed some changes, or I suppose late arrivals of the pipi wharoa and the koekoea in the season. I suppose the conclusion as to why that has happened was inconclusive, if you like, from the study, but rather just to note that it had been happening. One thing I just wanted to sort of note, though, is often the arrival time is of the shining cuckoo, the pipi wharoa, in late September, they say. Now, I made a point earlier in my presentation that the saying in Māori is ka tahi te pipi wharoa ko te karere o mahu. Now, there's a distinction between mahu, which is the 4th month of the Māori lunar year, and September, which is the 9th month of the Gregorian calendar year. They don't line up specifically. So spring, for example, always you know, we were in spring automatically as soon as we hit September. Manguru shifts around a bit depending on the lunar phases and such, and so therefore, so too does the arrival of the shining cuckoo, or the pipi wharoa. And that is to account for the fact that the natural cycles of when the bird migrates here is in tune with the availabilities of food and all of that, which is connected to those natural cycles. So a partial, I suppose, response to your question. Thank you.
Kia ora, Amon. Thank you. Gary also may have some thoughts on that he'd like to share.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting to hear Amon talking about the apparent late arrival of the shining bronze over in New Zealand of late. The last couple of years in southeast New South Wales in particular, we've observed several of the cuckoo species arriving really quite late. This year, for example, the Australian coil and the channel-billed cuckoos arrived really very much at the end of the period that you'd normally anticipate that they would arrive. This is a little bit of conjecture on my part, but when you observe on a daily basis the airflow patterns, particularly the prevailing wind flows across southeastern Australia, you tend to see when you get into that period where there are continuous and regular northerly winds flowing down the east coast, that you start to get some of the earlier arrivals of those larger cuckoo species, whereas this year there was a very protracted period of continuous prevailing southerlies that may potentially have pushed them northwards or kept them at bay. We know, for example, from some of the work that's been done over in Western Africa, looking at the movement of some of the smaller raptor species in that part of the world, they do tend to vary quite significantly their movement patterns over time, depending on where the prevailing airflows are actually going. And it's something that we've got a very strong aspiration towards, moving towards trying to actually get some of the new really lightweight and persistent satellite trackers onto some of these species to get a much better understanding of, firstly, how is it that they're moving, how are they interacting with air currents and with environmental conditions to be able to move around on their flight paths, but also as well critically to identify where these species are actually going when they move beyond the Australian mainland, particularly into the north. Thanks, Justine.
Thanks, everyone. That's great. Look, a few more corridor questions to come, but I'll just take it in order that people have made Q&A in the chat. So a question for the whole panel from Dave saying, great talks, many thanks. Question for the panel around improvements to connectivity are often touted as a proactive means of reducing future climate impacts. So that's in my introduction, you know, I was signaling that, you know, wildlife movement could be a really key solution here for some of climate change adaptation. So Dave's asking from our collective perspectives, what do you think are the best ways to maximise these future benefits of connectivity in a changing climate context? Any thoughts there?
I'm happy to jump in first, but I think it's going to be a long discussion, this one. I mean, I think we take the view that connectivity is one of the functions of a healthy, resilient landscape, and you've got to see it in that context. And that climate change, to a large extent, will only accelerate the stresses already hitting our biodiversity. So we work with a number of groups to try and reduce those current stresses, fire, ferals, whatever, fences, as well as improving the linkages. Now, in second point, in the Australian and perhaps particularly the West Australian context, you know, we're not building connectivity for the caribou or the wildebeest to go up and down their well-worn path. It's a boom and bust environment, and different species move in all sorts of different directions, and the same species will move in different directions in different seasons. So for us, it's about maximising large-scale connections, and that's why we've been working towards linking our main national parks and natural areas with at least 2 kilometre wide bands of healthy bush that's healthy in itself. And we can do that merely by taking another 10 or 15,000 hectares out of the wheat belt. And I think in terms of maximising the benefits, a key question is how can we maximise the scale? And the big debate over here is with your restoration, we've helped about 17 or 18,000 hectares of paddocks be restored. Do you try and do it at what the Ecological Restoration Society would call 3-star, which means most of your wildlife will move through it and into it? Or do you spend an extra $5,000 a hectare and try and do it at 10-star? You do less hectares. So we're opting for as much as possible at a reasonable standard. But it's a real curly question, and I think we should all be working on this a lot more.
Thanks for those observations. It's a challenging question, and we'll probably come back to that today. So I'd like to, Gary's made a comment for Amon, just more of a comment than a question, but thank you so much for prompting thoughts. So much of what makes us human is because of the wildlife that surrounds us, our stories, our art, our songs. We are impoverished and diminished by the loss of nature. So thank you for that comment, Gary. We also had a couple of comments coming through the chat as well. Kylie, any experience of virtual fencing around your roading questions or your infrastructure corridor questions? Any comments on that, or in fact the other panelists as well?
Yeah, virtual fencing is a tricky one. It tends to not be relevant for species like the squirrel glider, because our research has shown that if they can't make the distance across the gap, they generally won't try very often, and so they're not as susceptible to mortality. So we have some extensive research that shows their survival rates in roadsides are pretty high as away from roadsides, which is good. But virtual fencing, the jury is still out. There are some real concerns about its capacity to be effective over a long time frame. And pretty much every second study that comes in contradicts the previous one. So in the short term, there's work that shows that yes, animals respond, but with any kind of mitigation that relies on the animal being frightened by a stimulus or warded away by a stimulus, there is always a risk that over time that will peter out and that effect will die off. The way I think about it is that if they're not frightened by a truck, I don't know how a high-pitched sonic noise is going to keep them away from a road sign for very long. So it would be wonderful if they were effective, because they can be rolled out over a broad scale. The fencing doesn't have the detrimental impacts that physical fencing has. But at the moment, we know that the most effective way to reduce mortality on roads is through physical fencing and physically restricting animals from moving onto the roadside.
Thanks, Kylie. Any other comments on that, given that's a sort of a fencing versus non-fencing has been a bit of a discussion today? Otherwise, I'll move to the next question, which is for Millen. Okay, onto the next question then. We could be stuck for a long time otherwise. So, Millen, this is a question from Robin. How is your evidence of old eels, old tuna, being chopped up, not creating immediate change in management of the power station discharge over the waterfall? Can they not easily create a gentle slope or in that's properly maintained with smaller grades? So your thoughts on that would be welcome. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. The dollar, really, everybody, a wider power station, it's right, the cost of mitigation. And cultural change too. Up at the Hikarangi swamp, where we have the 7 pump stations, causing great difficulties. I think the budgets were, the quotes were around about $2 to $3 million each for spiral turbines to get our eels past those pump stations. The dollar, has always come into it. But you also need that cultural change, that mindset change. Within our Northern Regional Council, our regional councils, who have the responsibility in New Zealand for water, and from our our farming industries, and commercial also in the cities. But we do have a Resource Management Act, and it does say safe fish passage within it. But our councils don't enforce it, so it's But then again, you have to have the good monitoring and assessment and evidence-based to be able to show it. Then you can start to push the boundaries that they put up. So it's all, yeah, a good evidence-based. We're getting there a little, but yeah, still great resistance. But in New Zealand, we're just going through a new development of the Resource Management Act. It's been in place since 1992, I think. And we're redeveloping all of that, and it's out for submissions now. And but Māori have been able to, our people have been able to get a role in it all under the principles of Te Mana o Te Wai, where the rivers come first. And through that, we hope that will be our catalyst to change that, have that cultural change. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you for that observation, Millen. And look, I'm conscious we're running a little short of time, so one or two final questions, depending on how we go. This is a question from Jim in the Wairarapa, and I think it's a question to the wider panel as a whole, but we should feel free to jump in, whoever's best placed to answer this. This is Jim, who's establishing, working with others, I presume, corridors for all fauna as a connectivity corridor in the region. It's a very dry region. It's often sheep and beef type pasture. And then there's some very, very big mountains connecting, if you like, or separating the Wellington region from the rest of the Wairarapa region, for those who don't know the area. So the question is, for when establishing corridors for all fauna, where do you start? Where's the best place to start? I'd like to invite a couple of speakers in. Jump in, whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first if I may, Justine. Starting with the principle of retaining and very much building on some of the comments that Keith was making earlier in relation to the climate question, starting with what you've actually got. So in the first instance, securing what's left, maximizing the number of opportunities and really having them there as the foundation upon which you build connectivity across the wider landscape. And we place a very strong emphasis on identifying what we call anchor properties, properties around which we look towards building connectivity to both bolster and buffer the values of those properties for biodiversity, but also to have them act as the source to recolonize and repopulate habitat as it's restored in the wider landscape. Obviously, it takes a bit of time and there needs to be a great deal of thought put into that, particularly if you're thinking about how to actually get the interaction between populations that may have been genetically isolated from one another for long periods of time. Worthwhile, obviously, exploring in greater depth to what extent that those connections are going to be useful versus detrimental. That's a question that we've often had to address in Great Eastern Range, is ensuring that we're not connecting up populations and encouraging outbreeding depression. But I'd say in the first principle would be start with what you've got, secure it, look towards building from there. And obviously, as part of that as well, use the landholders that have got those little gems in the landscape, use them as your ambassadors, because quite often they're much better placed and more able to get their neighbours on board than somebody coming in from the outside.
Yeah,
great, thanks.
Brilliant response, Gary. I just want to sort of reiterate that there are some examples of that exact approach happening up in the Kaipara, an initiative called the Forest Bridge, and they are establishing a corridor from the west to east, east to west, across from the Kaipara to the west coast to the east coast, and they are adopting that very same approach of, for example, fencing off existing stands of native bush as their first port of call to protect them, and purely by fencing them off, you see an immediate regeneration of understory of flora within those areas. And then, as Gary mentioned, working with the landholders as ambassadors and building, I suppose, a movement with them to create momentum to further establish those connections of those ecological connections. So essentially what you're getting are stepping stones, if you like. I don't know if it's a technical term, but it's a term that's used in the space of connectivity conservation to allow the movement of species across those areas. who, in so doing, if they're eating, the birds are eating the seeds, so they're then re-seeding those areas as they carry out their duties, so to speak. So just a plug for the Forest Bridge Trust. Check them out. They've got a great website, and they do some excellent work.
Thank you, everyone, for those comments. Jim's also signalled that he's, he and his colleagues are trying to do what Northland has done, so connecting main forest and fragments. So there'll be some offline conversations around learnings and some of the practices up here. So thank you very much for that question. That was really helpful. I'd like to take a couple, we've got running out of time a little bit. So one short question, I think, which is around the movement of plants and seeds. Keith mentioned that is a key concept in his discussion. So a wide question really is plant movement as significant, including in the east of Australia, given the extent of fragmentation there? How do others on the panel also see plant movement? Thank you.
Oh, certainly extremely important. One of the reasons that we like to cast a spotlight on long distance mobile species, particularly nectarivorous species, grey-headed flying fox or various honey-eater birds, for example, is the important role that they play in firstly helping to transfer genes across the landscape. So pollinating trees in areas that quite oftentimes they would not necessarily otherwise be able to move beyond the fragmentation barriers that they have, where the wildlife acts as a vector in effect. We have extensive studies in subtropical and tropical rainforests that demonstrate the critical importance of the interaction between, for example, certain fruiting species and how they interact with the acids in the stomachs as they're processed in various rainforest birds, for example, some of our frugivorous pigeons. They're fundamental to ensuring the continued dispersal and movement and recolonization of those plant species across the landscape. And in terms of the actual movement of the plants themselves, again, we have so many conversations where we talk about wildlife itself, and Keith is often one of the first people to pull us up and remind us that plant species need to be able to get around as well, and in terms of a strategy for their own long-term adaptation, but also to be able to continue to move through the landscape and recolonize as environmental conditions change.
Yeah, well, I'll pick up on that if I can, Gary. Yep, plants. Thank you for raising that. And I think for us here, and I know everywhere is unique, but Southwestern Australia is such an old place. It's only really comparable with Cape Province in South Africa. What I think it partly gets to your timescales you're working on, and there's some very urgent wildlife needs right now. But if we look across the area we've got as Gondwana, you can actually see evolutionary pathways. There are plant species that morph from one to another across a few hundred kilometres. And, a huge question we wrestle with is how do you keep some of that evolutionary vigour alive, even if the changes may be, the benefits may be 1,000 or 10,000 years away. Bigger is better, and as bigger representation as you can of the species. The other question we wrestle with, and it's a particularly important one as the wave of carbon revegetation money is hitting us, is how much do you mix up, can you justify mixing up the species? I'm sticking the plant species. I'm sticking with the precautionary principle. We try and have all plantings to come from seed within 10 or 15 kilometres of where they're going in. And I think with our genetics, our plant genetics here, it's a very foolish person who thinks we can play God and shift a species from 100 kilometres or 200 kilometres away down because the climate's going to drive them down anyway. But these are the mega issues of our time. And I just proceed cautiously, but make it a very active discussion.
Thank you for those comments. Anything else on that topic? Otherwise, I'll do one question from the floor and then a closing question. So Vicky is asking around, she's in northern New Zealand. She's saying that there is increasing fragmentation, particularly as rural subdivisions go in, and she's concerned about further loss of habitat in terms of clearance, a 20-metre buffer zone around buildings for fire protection purposes, particularly in the far north. Is this an issue, the 20-metre, building platform sort of clearance swathe, or do you have any details? If it isn't an issue, do you have any ideas around how to address that habitat clearance? Thank you. To the panel.
Oh, no one's jumping in.
It's probably, yeah, I'll jump in there. It's a question that's been raised recently, actually. And it's, it's bound up in this balance between increasing population and how do we accommodate this increase, and our reliance on and dependence on having thriving ecosystems from which we derive our livelihoods. So it's very much a political debate. I think the long and short of it is it will have undoubtedly an impact. And I suppose going back to the challenge I put out there, is what affirmative action are we taking to offset any of those likely impacts by being creative, looking to other areas where we can, I don't particularly like the idea of offsetting, but it's something that we have to, I suppose, consider, offset those impacts that are created through subdivision crawl, creep, if you like. I mean, it's relevant for example, the water infrastructure in the north, where these new reservoirs are being established, and where there is an impact, an ecological impact, that needs to be offset somehow. And I'm not sure of the particular legislation as to whether or not that's required for subdivision creep or not, but it should be, and that resourcing could be made available to reinvest into some of the efforts of the groups that are doing good to grow our resilience, ecological resilience.
Got it, Amon. Thank you. Keith may want to add something there.
Sure do. Look, I think we're still absorbing the immensity of the changes we're living amongst. And I'll say quite bluntly, we should not be doing small rural subdivisions where people think they're going to live on a small couple of acres or something in amongst the trees. Number one, it's destroying more valuable bush. Number two, they're going to burn. Simple statement. Everywhere is now highly flammable, and we actually need to be quite strongly rethinking how we cluster houses. We have folk here who bought properties that have been revegetated, but they're 300-hectare properties, and they put their infrastructure in a defendable area in the middle. You just can't do small rural bush subdivisions anymore.
Thanks. And I'm not sure if it's the same in New Zealand, but I know the fire risk is definitely going up in New Zealand as climate change impacts start to bite, but certainly an issue, absolutely an issue, and I think an emerging issue for us too. I'd like to close.
Particularly in the north too.
Yes, particularly in the north. So that's very relevant, Keith. And look, Australia is a little bit of what I'd call a bellwether for some of the climate change impacts on society, on our communities, on our ecosystems. So we're very aware of your experiences and some of the costs of those in many senses. I'd like to finish now with a question for Gary, Amon and Keith. I guess it's an open question around how you see the importance of connectivity conservation in terms of providing comprehensive natural solutions to the joint challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. And these are our two big questions of the day. I think Keith or Gary talked about these daunting issues of our times, and certainly we're seeing lots of amplifying risks coming through. So any comments, all comments, and I'll tie us up, I'll wrap us up in about 4 or 5 minutes. So go for gold till then.
Okay, certainly. I think in the first instance, we need to acknowledge that there is the inextricable link between biodiversity and both the integrity and the resilience of natural systems. And the fact that if you're wanting to be able to maintain significant stocks of carbon to reduce the emission of carbon from systems, one of the most effective things that we can do here and now is to actually stop the degradation of natural ecosystems. We know that if you want to retain carbon, the most effective means of doing it is to retain it within productive, fully functioning, biodiverse systems. So that's probably the first thing that I'd suggest by way of intro to the rest of the panel.
Well, look, if I jump in now, that means Amon can see us out by putting it in song. Look, you know, the natural world is all connected. So all these things, you know, I am a little bit concerned that the focus is so strongly on global climate change that we're pushing the other solutions and other things that need to be tackled a bit to the side. In our case here, we have a real synergistic opportunity if we can grasp it well, in that we've got to wind back on fossil fuel energy production, absolutely. And while we're doing that, we've got to try and retain what carbon's in natural systems and grab a lot more. There is significant amounts of money becoming available for carbon sequestration plantings. And our big challenge is to make sure they land in the right place in the right way, which includes the community and cultural benefits, as well as the biodiversity benefits and the climate benefits. And if we can achieve that, then the remnants of the Southwestern Australia system that we have here will be a lot more robust than they would have been, and we would have made some contribution to reducing global carbon levels. And I should add, and we haven't really discussed it this time, an increasing focus on fire management here, because that is changing the faunal and plant structure of our systems and pushing unbelievable amounts of carbon into the atmosphere from 500,000-year-old systems that were stable. And on that cheery note, we'll hand over to Amon.
Not an insignificant question, and I won't be singing my way through this one. First thing I suppose is to kind of reflect on the theme of the presentation that I delivered today, and that is to say that we know that so much of our Indigenous knowledge the world over is bound up within biodiversity and knowledge of that biodiversity. Our language, our song, our art is one of the earlier sort of questions sort of alluded to. So there's a whole richness of knowledge culturally that exists within biodiversity. The second thing is that there's a current study underway here in Aotearoa under the National Bioheritage Challenge, which is particular to biodiversity, connectivity, biodiversity, and understanding the monitoring of it. And what it's noted in the early stages is that for any given biosphere to just survive, 20% of that biosphere needs to remain intact. So anything less, it's going to die out, it's going to decline, so a wetland, forest, a waterway, or what have you. Anything less than 20% of it, it's going to fail and cease to exist. But the interesting thing to that is that is a caveat to it, is that 20% of an ecosystem needs to be connected ecologically to another ecosystem. It can't survive on its own. It needs to be connected ecologically to other biospheres for it to survive. So what that is essentially saying is that the science that we already know is that biospheres, our environment needs to be maintained in a connected manner. So with those two kind of comments, what we know is that connectivity is critical for the resilience of the ecosystem, and it's also critical for the maintenance and I suppose continual growth and creation of Indigenous knowledge, or knowledge in general. I suppose to Keith's point around the immense amount of resourcing that is out there, what is it, $60+ a tonne of carbon now in the carbon market currently. Sean Weaver, one of our previous speakers at the last webinar, offered some solutions, models for carbon sequestration. The distinction, I suppose, or the difference with what he proposed, or the model that he proposes, is it's not just about sequestering carbon for the sake of it and to generate revenue for investors and landholders, but it's about stacking the outcomes, both biodiversity outcomes, the social outcomes, the cultural outcomes, and so on and so forth. And that is, embodies, at least in one way, the whole approach that Northland, GER, Reconnecting Northland takes, is that connectivity is not isolated. The whole premise of connectivity is to connect all of these various spheres, and in so doing create far more resilience, not just of the environment, but of the people who rely on those environments to survive, basically, and thrive, ultimately.
Got it, Amon. And look, I'm just conscious of time here. We've had a lot of lovely comments and things come into the chat and the Q&A function. So thank you everyone who's acknowledged that. We appreciate that. I'm very conscious we're running over time now. So I would like to, first of all, just thank our wonderful panellists. You are amazing. And thanks to our participants for being so engaged and wonderful. And I would now like to invite Amon as the Paumana too of one of our Callan's hosts to formally close this meeting. Kia ora anō.
And thank you, Justine. Thank you for being such a fantastic MC today and stepping into the fray. I want to meet you, and also to support acknowledgements to all of the crew. Behind the scenes too, Patrick, Tandy, Zoe, the ECU crew, wouldn't have been possible without all of you. And to all of our speakers, all our listeners, viewers, me kawa tēnei kia koutou. I'll close us off with the karakia, and this karakia is about encouraging us to take from today any of the little gems that you might that might resonate with you, and to hold fast to them, to hang them on your wall so that you can refer to them later. And so with that, kia kora kia tātou. Nuhia atura te pūtaki o ngā pūraru I te wārana, nuhia atura te hautaku o ngā eriki. Whakeiringia kia paitara whare, me rongo, whakeiringia ke ki runga kia tīna, hui e, tāi ki e.